Hello everyone, welcome to the GeoEcologist. I am Dr. Krishnanand and you have been watching my videos on environmental geography. So in this session on environmental geography, we are going to learn about the environmental hazards and its remedial measures. So what we have done is we have divided this topic into two parts so that we can cover various aspects of environmental hazard. So in this session, we are going to look at the three important environmental hazards and its remedial measures, that is about floods, cyclones and also earthquake as well. So earlier we have also discussed about the earthquake in the previous sessions in geomorphology as well. So here we are going to do that in a very crisp manner and also look into the remedial measures of it. So before we go ahead, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and do share the videos with others as well. So now let's talk about environmental hazards and remedial measures. Now in this lecture we are going to discuss in part 1 the three major environmental hazards like earthquake, flood and cyclone, and also its remedial measures that could be taken. Now remember, there is a confusion amongst the concept of natural hazards and human-made hazards, which are often mistakenly said as natural disasters. Now remember, there is nothing called natural disasters. Disasters are just a singular concept of totality, right? So it's just disasters. Natural are hazards, right? So you'll find many books and many articles written on natural disasters under which they discussed earthquake, flood, cyclone. But these are not natural disasters. These are natural hazards. So that is the first clarity. And if you have not watched my video on the concept of hazard, risk, vulnerability and disasters, go to the playlist and you can watch it there on my channel as well. Now, when we look into these environmental hazards, what do you understand? Why are these hazardous? And why I say there is nothing called natural disaster. Disasters are the cumulative concepts. It has lot many smaller concepts that make something a disaster, right? So disaster is something which is a resultant of all these processes. It means resultant of vulnerability, susceptibility, resultant of your ability to withstand these hazards, right? It means your resilience. So it also encompasses the concept of the hazards. Now, if you look into the Arabic term al-azhar, this is basically meaning luck factor. Now remember, when we say natural disasters, right, we always talk about these concepts which are actually natural hazards, right? So why I am clearly distinguishing between there is nothing called natural disaster, because disaster itself is purely human-centric concept, right? It is nothing to do with nature. Why? Because disaster is the loss of human lives and property. If human lives and property is not lost, it's not disaster. That's a basic point here, right? So remember why I'm trusting that there is nothing called natural disaster. It's simply disaster. That is the first point to remember. Now coming to the natural hazards, we need to understand these three natural hazards in this first part. So let's understand now. So the first important point here is that environmental hazards can be defined in what way? It could be defined in those extreme events, either natural or anthropogenic. Remember, they can be human-made as well as natural processes which exceed the tolerable magnitude. It is beyond the tolerance. That's why it is hazardous, right? So it is beyond tolerance, beyond resilience of human beings, right? And also remember, it is talking about resultant into catastrophic losses of property, income and lives. That's how we say disasters happen. So disaster is something which is a resultant. It's not the process in itself. Process could be natural or human-made, but resultant could be only disaster. Disaster is here, property, income, lives and everything which is lost. So remember to distinguish between natural hazards and disasters, not natural disasters. That's important. Now, the term environmental hazard may be distinguished from environmental disaster because hazard is a process and the resultant is disaster. That's important. And it is also indiscriminate. It can be instantaneous. It could be rapid. If you look into the tsunami waves or sea waves, what? So these are rapid actions. These are instantaneous actions. These are indiscriminate. They don't discriminate between, one person or the other person. That's important. So that's why when we say or evaluate in terms of human beings' loss of life and property, we say it is disaster, right? But if it is just about the process, suppose floods or earthquake or tsunami, Remember, when human beings not there on the earth, then also these processes were there. It means these processes are not dependent on human beings. They are independent natural processes, right? But when human being talks about being at loss because of these processes, then we talk about disaster, right? So one is the process and one is the form. So it's like a functional relationship if you observe here, right? Then if you look into these particular points, that hazard includes flood, drought, diseases, invasive species, pollution of soil, water, air. And remember, severity of impacts from environmental hazard depend upon the level of exposure to those hazards. If you're not exposed to flood, there is no problem. But if you're exposed and if you cannot withstand, if you are not resilient enough, then you will have a problem with flood. So you are vulnerable to flood, right? And understanding the current and likely future risk is important. Then there is also a greater challenge of what? How hazards interact with one another, how they are linked together. That's also important because today we are using the words like land use, climate change, growing human population. And these are intertwined together. They are linked together, right, in a system. So that's how we need to understand these concepts of hazards and disasters. So on the basis of main causative factors, environmental hazards and disaster are of two types: natural hazards and disaster, anthropogenic hazards and disaster. There is nothing called natural disaster. Remember, disaster itself is just disaster. So natural hazards are further subdivided into two categories: planetary and extraplanetary. Remember, extra is coming from outside. Then planetary hazards and disasters are of two types: terrestrial or endogenous, that is volcanic eruption, earthquake, and atmospheric or exogenous, coming from outside. So air, that is cyclone, flood, drought. And also anthropogenic hazards and disasters are three types. So physical hazards, chemical hazards, and biological hazards. So in physical hazards, what we see? Landslides because of construction activity, because of deforestation, soil erosion, right? Then because of siltation, dam creation, or nuclear power creation. So earthquakes also happen. Then chemical hazards, so sudden outbreak of poisonous gases, radioactive elements. Then biological hazards, sudden rise in population of species in a given habited land, eutrophication. So many things that we see, right? So these are various kinds of hazards and the various kinds of its classification based on causative factors. Now, if we look into earthquake, the first one in today's session, that is earthquake and its management. So already we have discussed in details the earthquake, its various types, and also about the factors leading to earthquake. Now we are not discussing it here. You can go to the geomorphology playlist and watch it in detail about earthquake. What is here to be concerned is the process, and when we see the measurement of the process, we remember Richter always, right? CF Richter, who talked about measurement of intensity of energy released from within the earth. And remember Richter scale? So we measure the intensity, its strength, right, on Richter scale, which was given in 1935. And its scale is between 0 to 10. But at the same time, when we want to understand that how much impact did earthquake have on life and property, when we talk about the disaster component of this hazard, then we talk about Mercury scale, which is on 0 to 12. Right? So intensity of earthquake depends upon various factors. For example, magnitude, distance from epicenter, acceleration duration, amplitude of the wave, type of the surface, that is important, then water table, nature of geometrical or of the concerned region, right? So that's important. And also various types of constructions that we are doing, right? Is it engineered construction? Is it construction related to earthquake? Is it earthquake proof that we always speak, right? So remember, earthquakes are caused because of the disequilibrium in the interior of the earth. We have already learned about it in details in geomorphology. So volcanic eruption, faulting, folding, upwarping, downwarping, hydrostatic pressure changes due to human-made water bodies, reservoirs, lakes, plate movement, all these factors, nuclear explosions, testing, right? So all these factors contribute to various kinds of earthquake, and we have lots of life and property loss at various earthquakes that we have recorded. So what you find here is the difference between Richter scale and Mercury scale represented in this particular table. So if you observe, this one is the Mercury scale and this is on the Richter scale. So if you want to read it, you can pause the video here and you can read it for yourself, the differences. At 1, they are not felt. At the extremist level, they go maximum up to 10, right? And it is beyond that. If it is that extreme, it goes to 12 on Mercury. It means damage is of that extent which cannot be again maintained, right? So this is the thing which is listed here. You can find it out and you can pause the video here and read it for yourself in details, right? Now, looking into the earthquakes, its prediction still is not possible. So what do? We must need to understand that it could be only one thing that we could do is minimize the impact. How will we minimize the impact? By reducing the severity, frequency, and the possible size of vulnerability. That's important, right? So if we can reduce the severity, what we are going to do? We are going to do these management steps, right? So if you look into this world map, World Earthquake Report on Friday, 28th May 2021, if you observe this particular belt, Himalayan Alps belt, right, and this circum-Pacific belt, these are the major belts. If you observe this is also circum-Pacific belt part only, right? So these are the major belts where earthquakes happen. So some effective earthquake management steps are listed here. You can read them. So earthquake resistant buildings creation, right? Then earthquake zones should be clearly demarcated and construction of developmental structure should be accordingly done, right? Wooden houses, that is important. Reinforced concrete columns should be supporting, long walls. That's important. And there should be reinforced concrete footing for each structure. That's important. And earthquake prediction should be made long before its occurrence in order to save lives. But this is under research still, earthquake prediction, right? So still we have not been having this breakthrough of predicting the earthquake. But we are trying to monitor as much as possible and also look into the subsequent factors or the important factors along these fault lines, fault planes, and study of geology. So that's where earthquakes could be studied thoroughly so that we could manage these earthquakes and reduce the impact, right? Reduce the vulnerabilities. That's important. Then comes to the flood and management. Remember, flood is a perennial problem around the world and in India. So overflowing of river and crossing its bank and submerging the surrounding area is basically known as what is flood. And remember, high amount of precipitation along with, if there is deforestation, poor management of agricultural field, poor drainage system, unplanned urbanization creates a havoc of flood, right? So flood results in number of detrimental effects like damaging of houses, buildings, industries, damaging of crops. It also lowers soil fertility at many times and outbreaks of epidemics. After flood is gone, lots of diseases come out, right? So India being a country of many rivers with tropical climate, one of the major flood prone area or regions of the world is Indian subcontinent, right? So what is important here to understand that flood is caused mainly because of inadequate capacity within the banks of river to contain the high flow of water. So if the river cannot control that high flow of water, it splashes out. That's the whole idea, right? So there could be numerous factors related to it. Now, if you look into the Indian context, almost all Indian states have been affected by serious floods at some point or the other. It is a basic statistics that tells us that every year, 75 lakh hectares of land is affected by flood annually, right? And that's a problem across India. If you look into these images, you could have seen so many images in monsoon season and also post-monsoon season. So some important abatement steps or remedial measures that we say could be here that is listed. So you can read it yourself. You can pause the video. So it's dams and barrages construction that has been going on. Then steps should be taken for restoration of wetlands, flood walls embankment. Rivers should be interconnected. So interlinking of river is one concept that is being taught since about 2 decades now, right? But there is also a problem of ecological concern if we link to different nature of river. So that is alongside it. But there could be massive afforestation plan, right, to reduce the runoff over degraded areas. There should be proper warning. That is important to minimize the actually impact. People could be warned earlier so they could go to the safe location. Then government and NGOs working together. But remember, emergency flood control measure is one important part where locals have to be participated, right? Local community has to be involved. Then flood water in low-lying areas should be diverted through artificial constructed channels. So construction of dikes and channels are as important, right? So these are certain remedial measures related to floods. Now comes to the cyclone and its management. Now recently what we have observed is lots of cyclone happening, especially in the Indian Ocean, right? So tropical cyclones in details we have discussed in climatology playlist. You can go and watch there. Now here what you're looking at is cyclone as hazard. So when we say cyclone as hazard, there are two things that happen. One is the high intensity rainfall that happens, and there is a huge tidal surge of water, right? So, and across the area where the cyclone comes, high speed winds. So three things: winds of high speed, tidal surge in coastal areas, and also high intensity rainfall. So these are three things that create havoc in the affected areas and loss of lives and properties. So what you observe is this particular cyclone. Now what happens recently, what we have observed is that there used to be less cyclone in Arabian Sea and more cyclone in Bay of Bengal. It was 4:1 ratio, right? So 4 in Bay of Bengal, 1 in Arabian Sea. But now this is gradually changing, right? So some of them extremely severe with wind speeds higher than 167 km/h have been found in Arabian Sea occurring here, right? So what we observe is the global climate change impacting. The sea surface temperature is changing, right? So it was clearly told in US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, after study, that there is a severe problem of sea surface temperature change which is resulting in this particular anomaly. So according to IMD, Indian Meteorological Department, the ratio of cyclones in Arabian Sea over which severe cyclonic storms like Nisarga formed, and also the recent one which was Taukte, right? So remember, Amphan, Taukte, Nisarga, these are certain cyclones which have come up in recent times, and this ratio is now gradually changing from 4:1. That's important. And then there are 2 cyclone seasons in India that is now also changing in some way. And remember, April to May is one season, that is pre-monsoon season, and then you have post-monsoon season, that is October to December. And the states which have most impact are Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu and West Bengal. But now the western coastal states are also getting affected because of Arabian Sea that we observe, right? So that's important. So what do we do here? Cyclones are going to come, they are going to aggravate, and India is a peninsular country. To minimize the loss of life and property due to cyclones, there are several preventive measures, right? That's important. And National Disaster Management Authority is already doing a great job. So there should be massive plantation, shelter belt across coastal belt. There should be proper warning system that is already being improved, and gradually we are minimizing on the loss of life, and anticipation of cyclone is important, and also monitoring and reporting. Then effort should be made to preserve, maintain and replace coastal sand dunes as well. Then effort should be made to maintain, preserve barrier islands as well, right? These shelter belts, barrier islands, then dam, embankment, windbreaker should be constructed, right? So all these are important remedial measures to be taken into consideration, and government should take immediate steps to provide the relief and rehabilitation to people. So what you observe in the news is during earthquake, flood or cyclone, lots of preventive activities are needed, right? You have to reduce the vulnerability of the people. That is the most important in terms of remedies, if you observe, right? In terms of the process, the geophysical process that leads to earthquake, flood and cyclone, we have already discussed in separate lectures in climatology as well. But here we are concerned about these steps for reducing the vulnerability, increasing the resilience of people. That's the most important aspect here to understand in terms of remedies. So now, when we have discussed about the various aspects of environmental hazards and its remedial measures, that is part 1, in the next session, we are going to cover the remaining environmental hazards and its remedial measures. So stay tuned, stay safe, all the best wishes.